Hello, my name is Jude Griebel, and this is my exhibition, Illuminated Collapse, at the Grand Forks Art Gallery. In my work, I merge the body with landscapes to speak to ways that we consume and impact the world around us as humans. In short, sort of exploring the messes we make and how it affects the world around us. In this series, Illuminated Collapse, I'm showing 6 dioramas in which bodies are merged with compromised environments, speaking to the idea of planetary collapse and what that actually means. So looking at it from a very personal and reflective way. In these works, I'm using a lot of imagination and invention to try and provide new access points to understanding ecological collapse and disaster, and what that means to not only us, but other species. So in these works, you will see various landscapes in which ecological disasters are taking place that include bodies sort of supporting the landscapes in various ways. For instance, in one, you'll see a glacier melting and flooding a miniature city around it. The glacier is embedded with various eyes that are weeping rivulets of water onto the city below it. So it's a way of sort of looking at rising water levels and climate shift. And it's a sort of tongue-in-cheek way in talking about how we're all responsible and collective culpability. It's also a nod to historic fiction like Alice in Wonderland and The Pool of Tears in Lewis Carroll's famous fiction. So I'm tying in a lot of literary and sort of historic references from art history, fiction, and past instances of collective imagination to speak to these very contemporary pressing topics. In another work titled Gaining Ground, you see a figure supporting a landscape on its body, which is a sort of graveyard surrounded by multi-lane freeways. This is a piece that's really inspired by my time living in New York. It's referencing a certain cemetery called the Cavalry Cemetery in Queens, New York, which is the only green space in the area surrounded by multi-lane freeways. And so this figure is sort of bearing the brunt of all this weight. And a really interesting thing happens in this space where the only green space is filled with all these little boxes containing people, and the freeways surrounding it are all containing cars, which are little boxes containing people. So it became a really apt metaphor for a very overcrowded and busy world that's not able to support the humanity on top of it and hyperactive development. In another work called Black Ark, you see 2 hands supporting a black ark in a ruined landscape that's been clear cut, and there's logs on fire, and there's a procession of spectral animals being corralled around the landscape by bulldozers and up onto the ark. So it's sort of a reverse Noah's Ark narrative, where rather than this sort of foundational story relating to salvation of species, it's functioning in the exact opposite way, where these animals are representing various extinct species that are being corralled onto this black ark that just represents extinction. In another work called All Consuming, a figure is laid out and its body is doubling as a loading dock where various goods are being shipped and unloaded onto it and then carted into its mouth. In this work, it's talking about the sort of all-consuming nature of humanity and the shipment of goods and the constant extraction of resources. And the body with all these goods being shipped onto it and into its mouth is a sort of nod towards Swift's Gulliver's Travels, where the giant Gulliver is too small for the surrounding world and threatens to consume everything within it. So I'm trying to use these various imaginative narratives as access points to these pressing problems we're faced with in the world right now. The other access point that I'm trying to use is the miniature and the nature of the work itself. There's a really high craft sensibility to the work. It almost looks like dioramas you would see in a natural history museum or one of the miniature museums, novelty miniature museums you'd see in a tourist site, where you can see the whole world just walking around it as a viewer, looming over it. So in my works, I really want the viewer to sort of project their imagination into these landscapes I've created and maybe wander around there before facing these more complex problems I'm putting forward in the work. To create these works, they're all made by hand. Every little detail is carved from wood. I work with assistants for some of the carpentry and some of the fabrication, but all the final carving and rendering and painting is done by myself. And so they almost look like giant models that are put together for these exhibitions. So there's a lot of slow carving, rendering, and reflection in the work, where I sort of think about these themes and how they're going to play out in the sculptures while I'm doing the actual physical labor. In the final work in the series, called Through Ash, it sort of ends the series on a more optimistic note in the way that it shows a collapsed ashen landscape and this hybrid weed growing through the wreckage, and sort of symbolizing hope or something to come after, or new ecological beginnings in some way. The weed is referencing a common pigweed, which is a weed that often grows through concrete in cities, and it has little hybrid faces, sort of symbolizing a new horizon or new beginnings in this sense. So this exhibition has been touring for a few years now. It began touring in the US, in Brooklyn, and then came to Canada, where it's been to various sites. I'm really excited for it to be in a smaller community like Grand Forks, where there is a lot of natural materials being extracted and resources being extracted. And I think it can really add to this conversation surrounding these practices in positive ways, just by beginning a conversation in the community.